So I want to say one of the charts that that I found fascinating is this one here, and I
Oh
have to
yeah.
give credit to somebody named Matthew Klippen. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I don't
so
even try and say it.
right, yeah. So this is one of your charts,
yeah.
and I found this fascinating. Could you spend a few minutes just kind of explaining this?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a very cool chart. I first charted a couple of years, 3 years ago in Green Tech Media, and to avoid someone else claiming naming rights, I've termed it Klippenstein's law. I'll happily give it to more deserving person in the fuel cell sector later. And basically, what I found, again, having worked in solar and wind, I was always interested in how they scaled up. And you can actually see in this chart, if you look at the green and the red, you kind of see these little bumps where, Germany has a bit of a feed-in tariff, or, Japan or some other organization. So when these earlier industries were embryonic, were very nascent, you had this kind of very steady 40-ish% per year ballpark growth year over year. And then you had these sudden bumps, but they were remarkably similar on a logarithmic scale. Admittedly, on a logarithmic scale, everything looks similar. But when I took a look at the fuel cell production numbers, for the past number of years, they have actually followed along a very similar trend. And so I thought this was just interesting. This chart, at least based on near-term production promises, announcements from Toyota and Hyundai, stuff that they have announced are going to scale up in the next few years. This should be met for at least through 2022, 2023-ish. There are some longer targets where they've said, we want to have like 10 million vehicles around the world by 2030. And having been around the fuel cell sector for a number of years, I discount those long-term targets. But it will be interesting to see how long this trend continues to apply. And I guess the response that I would have, or the context for this, and context is always important, is that it wouldn't surprise me if batteries actually are increasing even faster at this stage because they are such a wonderful solution. Rather, it is that here's this technology that's kind of under the radar for a lot of people, just as solar was in the early 2000s, just as wind was in the mid 90s. And at some point, you get these growth rates start to hit an absolute value where people are like, this might actually have some value to it. So yeah, we'll see how long that trend continues. So it is also true. One of the prominent people here in BC who helped develop the BC carbon tax back in 2008, Mark Jacquard, has commented that it's not so much a question of efficiency, it's fuel switching. Ultimately, it doesn't matter as much if you're driving an e-bike or a battery electric vehicle, as long as that electricity is clean, ultimately. Now, there is congestion, and I anticipate that in 10 years, e-bike people will be haranguing EV drivers in much the way that EV drivers like to tease fuel cell vehicle proponents because e-bikes are so much better, blah, 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 we're scaling up, you guys are so slow. But ultimately, it's the fuel switching which gives you the main benefit. Everything else is sort of secondary, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or sort of just adjust the amount of the benefit you're getting, obviously. If
Right.
it's super efficient. So, Matthew, I have a question. How does this potentially impact fuel cell motor vehicles, like the Mirai or like the Hyundai or the Honda Clarity? I mean,
Right.
Does this potentially mean that we finally have a better source for hydrogen?
This would in the long term. Now, so I've got a chart in one of the other articles I think I may have linked in the background. It sort of compares batteries to exoskeletons. So for small critters, you can't beat exoskeletons. They have some disadvantages when you get big, which is why your largest creature with an exoskeleton is like a crab, one of those underwater crabs. Whereas all the larger creatures tend to be internal skeletons, vertebrates, basically. And the same thing applies with batteries and fuel cells. Batteries are fantastic up to passenger vehicles and some buses, some urban trucks. But at a certain point, you get this trade-off where the advantage of energy density of the fuel carrier outweighs the inefficiency that admittedly you get if you're starting with renewable electricity to go all the way to hydrogen and then back, basically. So I would expect there'd be a similar kind of a trade-off. That is a fairly common assumption. I think Honda, in announcing its partnership with Isuzu, recently said that they figure fuel cells will be bigger for trucks and larger vehicles. Trains, for example, have been a big new sector for excitement. There's been a German train running on hydrogen for the past 18 months or so. And again, there the operator concluded that their battery would have to weigh 33 tons and require massive infrastructure spends to suddenly charge at the various stations. Mm-hmm. So it's very much a complementary thing.
Yeah, there's a law about that. Is it Maxwell's law? I don't remember which one it is. That how the price drops as manufacturing increases, standard economies of scale.
Oh yeah, the learning rate or learning curves. That's right. So actually, the learning rate on batteries over the long term, not the past couple of years, but I think BNEF had that at about 18% per doubling of cumulative production. And data from Japan, from one of their fuel cell pilots, they have 300,000 fuel cell residential units, basically providing the first kilowatt of power, in cases of earthquake and so forth, but also all of a household's hot water needs. So they've used that 300,000 unit data set to show that every time cumulative production doubles, it's about a 17-18% drop, which isn't surprising because batteries and fuel cells are quite similar. It's just that one contains the energy inside the canister, if you will. The other has an external fuel tank. They're all thin films, very similar materials. Use one type of metal for one, you use a different type of powdered metal for another. So yeah, that does apply there. In terms of the doubling, the hilarity, to put a nail on the point of how small fuel cells were until recently, when Toyota made something like 400 or 700 Mirai in like 2015, that doubled the entire worldwide production of fuel cells for that year. And the year they went to like 1,000 or 1,500, that was triple over 2 years ago. So truly embryonic, like science lab kind of scale. Now, as we get to larger scale, prices come down to where it starts to become interesting for more little markets. And then you add those volumes together, you get to price points. And with hydrogen as well, you get to lower price points where it becomes more practical. All of it complementary to batteries as opposed to in competition with them.
Anything that reduces our fossil fuel use sounds great to me.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and that's the ultimate goal there. The hilarious thing is that I have seen solar and wind guys take pot shots at each other, but not nearly as energetically as in other sectors.
Yeah. Well, we've said many times that diversity is a good thing, and diversifying power generation, storage, whatever, is good. It gives us multiple paths. Some paths are better for certain applications, as you mentioned with your skeletal comparison, which is actually a really cool way of putting it. And that's a step forward is a step forward. We don't have to just do one thing, and that's a good plan.
And it's hard to convince people of that, which is the thing. Like Matthew said, you have the solar people taking pot shots at wind and wind taking pot shots, and everyone's like, no, we have to be the silver bullet. And, as we've said many times on our show, we have people who are hesitant to give up what they have because they're waiting for that one silver bullet, and it has to be perfect. And until it's perfect, I'm not going to make that leap. And it's so hard to convince people that the future really is a blend of technologies. You can't wait for that one silver bullet because it doesn't exist.